In my recent video about Huntley Drive in the news, I promised I would make a follow-up video, and this is it. As I gathered material for this video, it became obvious that I can't really talk about life on Huntley Drive without talking about the fields behind it, and of course the Woolsheds. I also received a lot of input from various people, who you'll see credited at the end of the video, and I trolled through past posts on two Facebook groups, Chanterlands Avenue Past and Present, and Hold the Good Old Days, and I gathered some information from them. But let's start by taking a step back to a time before Huntley Drive was even a thought on a drawing board. One of my favourite internet tools is provided by the National Library of Scotland. It allows the user to compare old maps against modern-day satellite imagery. In this snapshot, I've captured a view that encompasses all of the areas of interest to us. On the left is an Ordnance Survey map dated 1888 to 1913. But for reasons that will become obvious as we talk about features on the map, I think it actually reflects the layout as it was in or around 1907-1908. The Hull and Barnsley Railway, which was completed between 1880 and 1885, runs diagonally across the map. Springbank West runs across the bottom of the map. Chanterlands Avenue is just a short road running past Chanterlands Farm, which stood where Warncliffe Street is today. Chants ended at Perth Street, which was a single long street. The west side did not become Perth Street West until the extension of Chants a few years later. Perth Street passed under the railway embankment, as it still does today, and joined a short stretch of road in front of the National Radiator Works. Interestingly, when construction of the site began in early 1906, it was referred to in the Hull Daily Mail as the American Radiator Company. But by the 31st of May that year, when Alderman Larrard, the Mayor of Hull, laid the foundation stone, the newspaper had called it the National Radiator Company. Construction was completed later in the year, and as the factory appears on the map, that would indicate the map is from no earlier than 1906. Victoria, Park, Westbourne and Marlborough Avenues are all laid out, though not quite as far as they now extend, and they are still not fully built up. The area to the north of Perth Street is labelled Chanterlands, two words. One meaning of the word chanter is a hedge or a thicket of bushes separating two areas of land. So, in addition to answering the question, how did Chanterlands Avenue get its name, it also gives us a clue as to how the area must have looked before it was cleared to make the polo ground. Polo was played here from 1894 to 1907. The following is from the book Polo in Britain by Horace A. Lafay. A remarkable club in many ways was Holderness Polo Club, established in East Yorkshire in 1894. Space adequate for two grounds was secured on Westbourne Avenue, Hull. Those players associated with the pioneering efforts were Nicholas Dobray, Edward and Philip Hodgson, Thomas Holtby, George Holton, Edward, Fred and Joseph Hurtley, Joseph Stevenson and Clive Wilson. The members were enthusiastic but inexperienced, and it was difficult to find players willing to coach the neophytes. The 17th Lancers, then stationed in York, gave some much-needed help. The club never had more than a dozen players. However, the crowds were numerous, sometimes reaching 15,000 spectators. For such a small number of players, Holderness's fixtures were all-encompassing. Northward to Edinburgh, westward to Liverpool, Manchester and Wirral, and southward to Derbyshire, players and their ponies travelled far in the summer months. The nearer clubs, such as Catterick Bridge, faced their own problems, and eventually the Holderness Polo Club had to give it up in 1907. It was a brave venture indeed, in an area where polo faced tough times. As early as 1905, the idea to extend Chanterlands Avenue north to meet Cottingham Road was being discussed. An article in the December 28th edition of the Hull Daily Mail that year said, with regards to the concept, "It is now within the sphere of practical achievement. It will be the means of opening out the ends of the avenues." The idea lay dormant for a few years until a syndicate of developers bought the land after the Polo Club folded in 1907. The talk was still of extending north to Cottingham Road and the new cemetery. There was, however, a considerable barrier in the way of expansion that far north, namely the railway embankment. Nonetheless, this did not stop residents of the avenues from protesting loudly. They feared a new road would considerably increase traffic through the avenues, with a subsequent lowering of their property values. I can't help but wonder what would class as heavy traffic in 1908. Would, say, 6 horses an hour be cause for concern? I imagine the congestion we see nowadays would be beyond their comprehension. In November 1908, Messrs. Wellsted, Dossor and Wellsted submitted plans to the Hull Works Committee on behalf of a Mr. R. Foster, proposing the extension of Chanterlands Avenue across the old polo grounds. The proposal included extension of Park Avenue, Westbourne Avenue and Marlborough Avenue to meet the new road. The original proposal was for a 40-foot wide road. The Works Committee pushed back, requiring Chants to be 50-foot wide and the avenue extensions to continue the lines of their current streets. By the end of 1909, the new roads were in place and houses were being built, and by February 1914, a continuous row of houses existed on both sides of the new road. But the question of extending the new road further north was still being debated. And debated. And debated. To cut a very long story short, work didn't start until 1922, and the final part, the breaching of the embankment and construction of a rail bridge, was not officially opened until 17th of April 1925. With the area now open up, development of the land to the west of the new road could be considered, and by 1930 the story of Huntley Drive began. But before we leave this map, I want to point out a few features. Setting Dyke, which runs across the top of the map, has been around since the 1100s. The valley of the River Hull was a rather swampy place in ancient times, and the history of the development of the area is closely tied with the history of the drainage of the land. Until the 1960s, it was an open drain with water flowing from west to east. Water still flows in the dyke up to the southwest corner of the Bricknell School's playing fields, where it diverts into the Yorkshire Water Authority's joint northern trunk sewer. All of the dyke east of that point has been filled in. The area to the south of Huntley Drive is labelled Ewlands, so presumably it once housed sheep, and I'm surprised, therefore, that the drive wasn't named Newlands Drive. You can clearly see several drainage ditches which presumably once delineated farmers' fields, and you can see how the railway cut across those fields. I've marked 2 ditches which have probably long since been filled in. The triangular area enclosed by the ditches and the railway line is known locally as Bakersfield, and I'll be talking more about that later. Richard Gould recently posted to the Chanterlands Avenue Past and Present group some old documents dated around 1930, which he found amongst his house deeds. They are shown here with his kind permission. The first shows the parcel of land on which Murrayfield and Huntley would eventually be built. If I'm reading it correctly, the area is 11 acres, 1 rod, 38 perch and 5 yards. I'll leave it up to you to convert that to hectares. As previously mentioned, the strip of land behind the even-numbered houses on Murrayfield was once Setting Dyke, a part of the area's drainage system that has been filled in since the early 1960s. I was particularly pleased to see the depiction of a bridge over Setting Dyke in the top left corner, because my earliest ever memory involves that bridge. I know experts say that it's not possible for us to have true memories from our very early childhood, but I beg to differ. One day when I was in my 20s, a memory suddenly popped into my head. I recall my mum taking me across the bridge onto the school playing fields, and in my memory she was heavily pregnant. I asked my mother if that had actually happened, and yes indeed it had happened, just as I remembered it. My sister was born 2 weeks after my 2nd birthday, so I know for a fact that I was no more than 2 at the time, which dates the event to 1955. The bridge was somewhere behind number 72 or 74, in that area. The next drawing shows the same parcel of land, but now with Chanterlands Avenue cutting off the northeast corner and reducing the size of the proposed development to 10.665 acres. The accompanying text is easy to read but difficult to understand. The top document describes the area. All that close of meadowland, commonly called ewe-lands, part of a close formerly containing 12 acres, 1 rood and 24 perches, or thereabouts, I love the way they spell that, containing 11 acres, 1 rood and 38 perches, or thereabouts, site in the Saltings in the parish of Cottingham, in the East Riding of the county of York, then in the Ocon, I have no idea what that means, in the Ocon of Arthur Smith, which said piece of land was more, and here's where it becomes very confusing, parley delented on the map or plan-ended. I don't know. I don't know what the rest of that means. Likewise, the section at the bottom there, it appears to be something about the bridge that I've just talked about, but I'm not quite sure exactly what it's trying to say. Perhaps Sidney Biggs owns the bridge and is giving it over to John Riley or Richard Riley or something like that. Make of it what you will. In the third diagram, the 2 roads are now laid out. Murrayfield Road has already been named, but our drive is simply called New Street for now. This article from the Hull Daily Mail's December the 1st, 1930 edition confirms the name Murrayfield Road and asks readers for suggestions for the names of 2 other streets in the same area. Now, presumably one of those streets is what became Huntley Drive, but what was the other street? Southfield Road, maybe? Perhaps Loveridge? I can't find anything else about it in the paper, so we're left guessing. There are 69 houses on Huntley Drive, 24 even-numbered houses on the inside of the drive's curve, and 45 odd-numbered houses on the outside. From ads in the Hull Daily Mail, we know that 2-bedroomed houses were selling for around £385 and 3-bedroomed houses for £550. People were moving into their new houses by 1932, though it took a few years before all building work was complete. As with any residential area, some houses will be occupied by the same family for decades, and others change hands frequently. The drive is no exception. I'm sure a dedicated researcher with access to the appropriate property records and electoral rolls could paint a complete picture of the history of each house, but that's not my intention here. Instead, I shall take as my starting point a document created at the outbreak of war, known as the 1939 Register. It was a census of the civilian population of England and Wales in September of that year. For each individual in each household, it listed their name, date of birth, gender, marital status, and occupation. When completed, it became a tool for managing the wartime military draft and the allocation of civilian labour. The yellow labels show the name of the family living at a house in 1939, and the blue labels show subsequent changes of ownership. I should perhaps also point out that I've tried to be sensitive to privacy concerns, especially when it comes to publishing people's current address. There are a few properties where I know the name of the current owner, but have omitted that information. Where I do name current occupants, it is with their permission. As I said earlier, this isn't a comprehensive list of occupants, just a few changes that I became aware of during my association with the area. For example, the very first house on that side, number 2, was vacant in 1939. In the 1950s, a family named Cook lived there. Mr. Cook was one of the rare car owners on the drive. You can see his car in this photograph taken from the front garden of number 23. Is it a Volkswagen? I'm no car buff, so please correct me if I'm wrong. Mr. Cook often left his car on the street, leaving it at risk when we were playing football on the road, and even greater risk when we played cricket. But as far as I can recall, we never did any serious harm to it. One of my very best friends was Alan Stutz, who lived at number 59 Murrayfield. One Christmas, when we were 10 or so, Al and I smuggled our hymn books home from Bricknell Junior School with the intention of earning some money carol singing. Typically, people would give us money to make us leave their doorstep as quickly as possible, but not Mr. Cook. He stood and listened to us, and when we finished one hymn, he asked for another. We really hadn't counted on that. I can't remember how much he gave us for our efforts, but whatever it was, we never went back there again. I knew the Dawson family at number 8. George and Irene were friends of my parents. In fact, I believe George worked with my dad at the East Yorkshire Bus Company. They had a daughter, Maureen, a few years older than me. She hung out with our gang occasionally, but was never a regular. The Wandler, Scarborough and Woodall families were all still in those houses in the late 1950s. I don't remember much about any of them, except I recall Walter Scarborough had a motorbike and sidecar that he and Dora made good use of with frequent trips away. In later years he switched to a Morris Minor, which must have been considerably more comfortable. Number 16 was purchased by Philip Ward, who had, up until then, been living with his parents at number 24. Sadly, Philip died suddenly before moving in. The house was then sold to the current owners, who have made some serious additions to it. If you're in the neighbourhood, be sure to check out the wrought iron gate on the side of the house. It'll give you an indication of the owner's sense of humour. On the opposite side of the street are, of course, the odd-numbered houses, seen here in photographs from the 50s, 60s and 70s. Construction of the drive probably started with these properties, because I was able to find mention in the Hull Daily Mail of people living there prior to the 1939 register. The pinkish-coloured labels show these early occupants. I knew the Baldwin family, Mike, Pat and their daughter Deanne, who lived at number 7 in the 1980s. Mike was the oldest of the 5 Baldwin brothers who grew up in one of the prefabs on Chants Ave, opposite the entrance to Murrayfield. The Campbell family, Alan, Agnes and newborn Duncan, moved into number 9 in 1940. Sadly, Alan died aged 35 on October 1st, 1943. My grandmother, at number 23, took young Duncan under her wing, caring for him when his mother had to work. Duncan lived in the house until the late 1970s. Reg Hudson, at number 11, worked for the Hull Telephone Company. He is the only non-fictional character I've ever seen wearing a deerstalker hat on a regular basis. There was also a lady named Mabel living there. My mother told me she was his housekeeper, but by the time they eventually married, I was old enough to figure out that housekeeper was probably just a code word to avoid having to explain to me what their real living arrangements were. They moved to Kirkella shortly after tying the knot. House number 13 was labelled 11A for a long while. Obviously, someone superstitious had lived there before. Indeed, the house did not bring luck to the family who occupied it during the war years, as William Jack Gibson was lost at sea in November 1941 while serving in the Merchant Navy. In the 50s and 60s, the Parkinson family had 2 children, Margaret and Timothy. I think their family might have been from the Parkinson family that lived at number 47, but I'm not certain. Timothy never really became a regular part of our gang, though he was close friends with both Paul Taylor from number 9 Murrayfield and with David Burnby, who lived at number 46 for a while. At number 17 lived Wilf and Monica Crowder. He was a watch repairer and department manager at Carmichael's, the posh jewellers in town. Monica was of German extract, which had apparently caused her some problems as a schoolgirl during the First World War, but I think she fared better during World War II. Wilf died in 1989, but Monica lived on in the house until her death at the age of 96 in 2004. The Hull and Barnsley railway line ran behind the houses on this side, but there was also a spur line running from Chants Ave Bridge through the fields and onto the Woolsheds. There were, therefore, 2 embankments behind the houses. We refer to them as top line and bottom line. Between the bottom line's embankment and the 10-foot behind the houses was a strip of land providing allotments to some of the residents. The area of the allotments is marked in green on this post-war map. They had obviously been a very important source of food during the harsh wartime days of rationing. During my childhood, in the 50s and 60s, Mr. Britton at number 1 Murrayfield set up goalposts on the plot nearest his house so his sons Rod and Steve could hone their skills. The next plot along was overgrown and contained a dilapidated old chicken hut, which we may or may not have accidentally set on fire on one occasion. And then came Will Crowder's plot, and he kept it in immaculate condition. I don't think weeds dared to grow there. You can get a feel for the orderly state of the area from this photo of my sister and some of her friends stood in front of the allotments in 1960. We'll come back to the allotments in a minute. Edwin and Alice Booth lived at number 19. He was a quiet man. A smile and a nod were about all I ever got from him. But Alice was the complete opposite, very outgoing, and she spoke with what sounded to my young ears like a very posh accent. Edwin died in 1973, and Alice lived on in the house until her death in 1980. Billy and Nancy Train were my neighbours. Her real name was Hannah, but he always called her Nancy, so that's how I think of her now. At the start of the war, they shared the house with Nancy's sister and her husband, Reuben and Harriet Lythe, who owned a costume and furrier shop on Ferrens Way, and unfortunately were in the shop when it was hit by a high-explosive bomb during a daylight raid on Monday, March the 31st, 1941. Reuben was killed instantly by the bomb blast, but Harriet lay buried under rubble for several hours before she was extracted and taken to Beverly Road Hospital, where she died 2 days later. My family lived at number 23. My grandmother bought the house a few months before the start of World War II and moved in with her 5 children. They don't seem to have taken many photographs during the war years. The earliest I have is this one of my mother aged 14 in the back garden. She appears to be wearing a bridesmaid's dress, probably for the wedding of her older sister Joyce in the latter part of 1945. The blank wall behind her is the air raid shelter. It almost looks as if it's part of the house, but it was in fact a separate structure. Some of the older residents of the drive may remember my grandmother, Mrs. Holden, a kind and caring soul who lived to the ripe old age of 96 before leaving us in 1984. My Aunt Dorothy, seen here with my cousin Mike at the front of the house in 1952, lived on in the house together with her brother Bob until her death in 2007. My fourth picture is a photograph taken from the back bedroom of number 23 in the early 1960s. My father is seen taking a photograph of my mother. The air raid shelter can be seen bottom right, and Nancy Train is doing a spot of gardening next door. There's rolling stock on the bottom line and a clear view of the allotments. Wilf Crowder's plot is on the left, but most of what can be seen was tended by Reg Hewitt from number 25. The Hewitts have been living at number 38 Huntley since 1948. They bought number 25 from Tommy Reinhardt for £1,650 in 1957. The sale was agreed on a handshake, and Reg, Eleanor, and their 3 children, Ian, Francis and Liz, moved in February of that year. I don't remember Tommy Reinhardt, but even though I wasn't yet 4 years old at the time, I do clearly remember the Hewitts moving in. I was excited at the prospect of having other kids right next door. Here we all are in the early 1960s, Ian and Francis on the left with Liz seated. I'm the little guy in front of Ian. Behind me are my cousins Mike and Robin, with my sister Anne on the far right. The blonde girl is a cousin of the Hewitts. At number 27, the 1939 register shows George Kettley and his brother-in-law John Dixon as the 2 occupants. George was married to John's sister Phyllis in 1931, so I'm not sure where she was in 1939, but she was certainly there when I was around in the 50s and 60s. If you've seen my earlier video about Huntley Drive in the news, you may remember John Dixon as the hairdresser who had to declare bankruptcy. George and Phyllis had a dog, Paddy, that must have been in contention for the title of the UK's oldest dog. He lived well into his 20s, and I remember him being very shaky on his feet and bald in many places. Or perhaps a better description would be threadbare. Thanks to Glynis Newell, I have a complete record of the occupants of number 29. Mr. J. H. Steele was the original occupant in 1932, followed by a police constable, Mr. W. S. Days, in 1935. In 1942, Joe Beck and his wife moved in and lived there until Joe's death in 1961, after which the Jones family moved in. Mr. Jones was a lecturer at the university. I remember him as a youngish and very cheerful man. In 1967, Mike and Glynis Newell moved in and have been there ever since, making them some of the drive's longest inhabitants. Glynis provided this description of the house they bought. The asking price was £2,700, but the Newells managed to get it reduced by £50, making it exactly £1,000 more expensive than the Hewitts' house, purchased 10 years earlier. In the 35 years between when the house was built in 1932 and when the Newells made their purchase in 1967, property prices had increased almost 5 times. Move forward to 2021, and number 27 has just been valued at £155,000. So in the 54 years since Glynis and Mike bought their house, property prices have increased almost 58-fold. Personally, I find that quite remarkable. Glynis provided me with a few photographs taken in the 70s. It's interesting to note what is probably a coal bunker at the back of number 27, a reminder that all the houses were originally built with coal fires that not only heated the house, but employed back boilers to heat water for washing and bathing. The photograph on the right shows what became of the allotments. The council had a plan to cut a path from Chants Ave by the bridge onto the fields, which would in turn be made into a park. They started by demolishing all the allotments, and then did nothing. Presumably funding fell through or priorities changed, but whatever the reason, the allotments were destroyed for no good reason. Poor old Reg Hewitt, whose red garage door can be seen open in the photograph, lost his vegetable plot and his orchard. Liz Hewitt has this to say: I remember the day they sent in the bulldozers to clear the allotments. Dad had carefully removed the glass from the greenhouse. Then the bulldozer drove over it. After that, the driver was very helpful, turning the apple trees over so that we could pick all the fruit. It was heartbreaking that nothing was then done to the land. George and Irene Rowe lived at number 31. Irene died in 1966 and George sold the house soon after. Number 33 seemed to be constantly changing hands, and I never knew any of the people who lived there. Arthur and Olive Riley lived at number 35. Olive died in 1966, which means I probably knew her, but I don't remember her. Arthur had been severely wounded in World War I. I was told he was actually placed in with the dead at a field hospital when someone noticed him move. He bore some of the scars on his face and wore an eye patch. As a youngster, I found this made him quite scary, but in reality he was a nice old man, always very friendly. Nonetheless, rumours of him guarding the apple trees in his garden with a bayonet in hand were sufficient for us to never bother trying to sample anything from his garden. The only people I remember with any clarity from this block are the Wards. I've already mentioned that their son Philip bought number 16, but then died quite unexpectedly. Mr. and Mrs. Ward were always very pleasant. They ran an appliance shop on Newland Avenue. The Jeffersons had a dog called Tiger. Apparently they bought it as a puppy, thinking it was a corgi, but it grew and grew and grew until it was a monstrous size. The dog was crazy. It used to chew bricks, and whereas most dogs are content just to chase cyclists or cars, Tiger used to chase trains. The De Lacy family moved into number 37 in the mid-60s. Mr. De Lacy, Michael, was away at sea a lot, and we hardly ever saw him. Mrs. De Lacy, Barbara, was from Hobart, Tasmania, and consequently had a very different accent from what we were used to. Her 2 sons, Richard and Philip, were around the same age as me and other neighbourhood kids who hung out on the field. When they first moved in, they would come out and play with the rest of us, but after a while they both went their own way and we stopped seeing them. Richard had a nasty accident when he fell and cut his face open on a rusty old abandoned car on the field. He was left with a permanent scar. Maybe that was part of the reason why he stopped hanging out with us. Michael and Barbara had a third son, James, born in 1968, but sadly Barbara died of cancer in 1972, aged just 39 years old. The family moved out of the drive after her death. Richard went on to a successful career as a barrister, but was also known as a thespian and a musician. He moved to the Cayman Islands in 2011 and passed away in July 2017, aged 62. Philip went to Hull Grammar School, where he proved to be a talented rugby player. He can be seen here in the centre and back row. He played not only for the school team, but was also playing for the Hull A team in 1972. I believe he went on to a career in law enforcement, but I can't be certain. We nicknamed Jeff Moses at number 39 Green Man, as we frequently saw him wearing green overalls. Something to do with his job, I believe. Number 41 is not listed in the 1939 register, and I have no idea why that is. Robert and Elsie Rowe married in 1932. Elsie was the daughter of Thomas and Elsie Nicholson next door at number 43. The Rowes had a dog called Pluto. It scared the living daylights out of us. It was usually kept locked in their garden, but if we ever heard Mrs. Rowe calling its name, we knew it had escaped, and we would swiftly climb the nearest tree for safety. The Parkinson family at number 47 had a son, Ernest, born in 1924, who I believe was the father of Margaret and Timothy Parkinson, who lived at 11A for a while. Henry Henriksen at number 51 was a stern and humourless old codger who quite obviously didn't like children. He would often come out to chastise us simply for doing what kids do. He'd been a railway policeman prior and seemed to carry an attitude over into retirement. We nicknamed him Hairy Henry and generally tried to give him a wide berth. I've no idea why we chose that nickname. He wasn't particularly hairy, but nonetheless the name stuck. In the early 70s, several of us had motorbikes. We would meet behind the baker's house at number 53, parking our bikes on the field. We tried to be respectful and mindful, but nonetheless, someone didn't like us being there, and showed their dislike by scattering nails and tacks around the area. One night, I saw Hairy Henry come out of his garden shed and throw something into the 10-foot. I was probably about 18 or 19 at the time, so not exactly a kid anymore and not intimidated by him. So I approached him. I didn't accuse him, even though he had to know that I'd just seen him do it. Instead, I just asked him if he'd seen anything. I explained the problem we were having and asked him to keep an eye open. We never had any more problems with him after that. His wife, Emily, seemed to live under his shadow, but after his death in 1977, she became quite outgoing and talkative. Sad to think that he'd been such a controlling influence in her life. She died in 1984. At this point, I'm going to skip along the street to number 67 and work backwards. Both 67 and 65, being on the corner, have larger gardens than others on the drive. The rear of their property was enclosed by a high concrete wall separating them from the drainage ditch that ran south of number 65 and then turned and ran behind numbers 69 to 89. Ronnie Wright at 67 kept chickens in his huge plot. I see that most of it now has houses built on it, but back in the day it could almost be classed as a small holding. The high wall was difficult to get over, but surprisingly easy to get under, and we may, or may not, have occasionally raided his hen house for a few eggs to fry up when we had a fire going in one of our many dens. Walter and Eva Fletcher lived at number 65 with their son, Nick, and daughter Jill. Walter was a long-distance lorry driver for a builder's merchant on Clough Road. Albert and Ivy Morton lived at number 63 with their son Rob. The 1939 register also shows Albert's mother, Anne, living there. She died in 1951, aged 79. Albert was a coal merchant, and, as already mentioned, all the houses in the neighbourhood were built with coal fireplaces, so business must have been good for a long while. Albert and Rob delivered coal to my grandmother's house, and I was always amazed at how they could carry such large sacks of coal on their backs. Albert in particular was not a big man, and the sacks looked bigger than him. Their garden was full of fruit trees, bushes and vegetables. Ivy's plum pies were famous, and her neighbours were never short of fruit in the summer. Ivy died suddenly in 1975, and Albert moved to Beverley, where Rob was then living. Albert died there in 1984. Rob is happily retired, and I owe him thanks for providing me with his own memories of life on the drive, many of which I have incorporated in this video. The house was sold to Oscar Sanderson, who moved there in 1975 from the railway cottages on National Avenue just ahead of their demolition. Jim and Renee Sheridan lived at number 61 with Renee's mother, Louise Adamson, and their two daughters, Mary and Wendy. The apple trees in their garden bore some of the tastiest apples I've ever tried. We didn't even have to raid their garden to get them. Mr. Sheridan cordially invited us to help ourselves, just as long as we didn't damage the trees. Rob Morton remembers them as his unofficial Auntie Renee and Uncle Jim, and said this about Mr. Sheridan. He was a really nice guy. He was a headmaster or possibly a deputy head at a secondary school somewhere in Hull. He once looked through from the gentleman's smoke room at the National Pub and saw 16-year-old me at the bar. Never said a word, just sent a pint across for me. A genuine old-school gentleman. Mary married in 1941 and moved out. Wendy did the same in 1951. Louisa died in 1966, aged 95, and Jim passed on 2 years later, aged 77. Renee died in 1994, just 3 years short of 100. Morris and Sheila Starkey and their children, Michael, born in 1946, and Lindsay, born in 1948, lived at number 59. Morris and his two brothers owned a couple of hardware stores on Beverley Road. Sheila died in 1963, aged just 40, while Mike and Lindsay were still both in their teens. Rob Morton tells of a time when he and Mike created a tin can telephone between their two back bedrooms, using a piece of string stretching across the Sheridan's house. It wasn't long before the string broke, causing much merriment to the rest of the gang who were stood in the 10-foot watching. Mike Starkey went to work in a bank after leaving school, and we believe he may eventually have emigrated to Canada. James and Muriel Savage at number 57 had 6 children: Joan, James, Ronald, twins John and Thomas, and Melvina, born between 1935 and 1946. Whenever the Savage family is mentioned, people tend to say, savage by name, savage by nature. The boys had quite a reputation for wildness and liked to wage war on the kids from National Ave. Their father was a trawler skipper, so was very often away from home, and during the war he served in the Far East. By the time I was old enough to play on the field without adult supervision, in the late 1950s, the two older boys had moved on, but occasionally we might see Johnny or Tommy, which I usually took as a sign that I should probably go home, better safe than sorry. Mr. Savage died in 2003, aged 84, and Mrs. Savage followed 2 years later, aged 95. The Knowles family at number 55 were an interesting and fun bunch. If you see my earlier video, you may recall that Robert Samuel Knowles shot his son, Robert William, in the leg during an alcohol-fueled argument in 1943. 2 years later, Robert Sr. died, aged just 46. And Robert William lived on in the house with his wife Gertie. They had married in 1940, and between then and 1954, had 5 children: Jean, David, Margaret, Robert, and Richard, or Ricky as he was better known. Robert Sr.'s widow, Martha, also lived in the house until her death in 1963, aged 64. She lived in the front room of the house, and the other 7 occupied the rest. Rob Morton, who was an only child, recalls having his tea there one night in about 1952-53 when he was 8 or 9. The family was noisy and lively, everyone fighting for attention. I felt very lonely when taken back home a couple of hours later. About 10 years later, I was there for tea one night. Things had quietened down somewhat by then, with only Rob and Ricky left at home, but things were still quite boisterous. Ricky was one of my best friends at the time, but around 1965, the family relocated to Long Hill and I lost touch. Pete and Tina Johnson were the next occupants of the house. On a visit to Hull in 2016, I was able to call in and visit for a few hours. Here we are on Bakersfield. Sadly, Pete passed away recently, but Tina is still there, another one of the street's long-time residents. 65-year-old widow Mary Dunn lived at number 53 in September 1939, but was soon replaced by the Philpott family. Doris Philpott and her young son Michael lived in the house, while Lieutenant Reginald Philpott, who was a career officer in the army, fought in Europe. He was wounded in the closing stages of the war and returned home, but his wounds can't have been too severe because, 9 months after he returned home, Michael had a baby brother. Next in the house were the Baker family, Annie and Renee. Their 3 children, Pauline, Clive and Andy, were born in 1952, 55 and 56 respectively. The 2 boys, along with Ricky Knowles, were an integral part of my childhood. This is the only photo I have with all 4 of us in it. We must have been having a bring your pets out to play day. If I remember correctly, my rabbit was a birthday present from Al Stutz, who I mentioned earlier. Behind our houses was that wonderful playground we simply called the field, and beyond that the Woolsheds. Let's quickly take a look at what made up our world back then. We had the Holden-Barnsley railway line running behind us on a raised embankment. We referred to it as Top Line, and it's still there today. The bottom line was a spur line that ran from the Chanterlands Bridge down a slight incline onto the Woolsheds and Radiator Fields. Although its embankment was not as high as the top line, we could still use it to sled down when it snowed. I remember 1963 saw a particularly heavy snowfall, and the whole neighbourhood seemed to be out there playing in the snow. One track crossed National Avenue, feeding into the National Radiator Works. Over the years, of course, it's been known by other names such as Ideal Boilers, Ideal Standard, Stelrad. It's considerably bigger now, and the rail connection has gone. The bottom line embankment was removed when the field was butchered in the late 1970s. The odd mound formed in the middle of Bakersfield today was made from its remains. We've already talked about Setting Dyke, a centuries-old ditch carrying water westward behind Murrayfield. Other ditches in the area marked out the landscape in the days when it was all farmland. I assume they were also dug hundreds of years ago. Even in my day, some of them were partially filled in, and I believe that process has been completed by now. I previously described the allotments and orchard behind the first few odd-numbered houses. There were plenty of trees, mainly hawthorns, but with a sprinkling of elderberry bushes and a few willows on the corner behind number 37. Remembering my earlier reference to the meaning of the word chanter, it's interesting to note that hawthorns are typically used as hedges. Keeping them hedge-like requires periodic pruning, and this obviously hasn't happened to these trees for a long time, especially along the lines of the ditches where the trees have grown out to their full height. There were a few random trees dotted around the relatively open spaces of Radiator Fields. I haven't tried to mark these on the map. They were probably the offspring of the more mature trees, propagated by birds or other non-human means over the years. I shall come back to the area between the railway siding and National Avenue, but for now I want to concentrate on the field. From the moment people with children moved onto the drive, there will have been children playing on the field. From my previous video, you may recall a group of neighbourhood boys organising a boxing tournament on the field to raise money for the war effort. My mother also played on the field during the war years. She was startled one day when several members of the Home Guard erupted from a ditch in a mock bayonet charge. They apparently conducted their training exercises there. There was continuity in the crowd that played together. Older kids might outgrow playing and move on, but their younger siblings and other friends joined the fray. I don't have many photographs taken on the field. Cameras weren't as ubiquitous as they are now, and besides, we were too busy doing stuff. Rob Morton provided this photo from around 1952-53. The three boys at the front are Rob, Dave Knowles and Nick Fletcher, and the four behind them are the Savage brothers. 6 or 7 years after Rob's picture was taken, I was photographed on the field. From left to right you see Paul Train, a nephew of the Trains at number 21, my cousin Robin, my Uncle Bob with my sister Anne, my cousin Mike, and yours truly. Also seen is my grandmother's dog, Floss. Rob Morton's dog was one of Floss's puppies. Every day was an adventure. We would build dens, climb trees, kick a ball around, dig holes for the heck of it, refight World War II with sticks for weapons, put nails on the top line to be flattened by passing trains to make spear points and arrowheads, light campfires and fry up whatever we could get our mums to give us, plus maybe some eggs from Ronnie Wright's. Mud pinging was a favourite pastime. For those who don't know what that is, find a fairly straight stick. Willow tree branches seem to work best. Place a blob of mud on the end, and with a quick flick, the mud flies off like a bullet. The annual bonfire was a big event. During October we collect impressive amounts of stuff to burn, but we found the safest thing to do was to hide most of it in small caches and use the rest to build a dummy bonfire. We'd make a show of guarding it, even had tripwires and tin can alarms set up one year, but often a rival gang from National Avenue or one of the other neighbouring streets would manage to burn it to the ground a day or two before the official bonfire night. No problem. We'd just pull our hidden supplies out and build the real bonfire on the day itself. Everyone came out to celebrate with fireworks and food. If we were lucky, someone would bring baked potatoes done in the oven at home. Otherwise, we'd try to bake raw potatoes in the fire's embers, and that seldom produced anything edible. In the mid-1960s, Mr. Baker rented the triangular section of land behind his house, fenced it off, erected a stable, and put a horse on the field. Everyone immediately started calling it Bakersfield, and the name stuck. This turn of events caused us some problems. This had been the area where we played football and cricket. We even had goalposts set up and a pitch marked out at one time. A large gang of kids from Perth Street West used to come, and we'd play chaotic 20-a-side games of football. But with the horse there, we had to move to the field on the other side of the ditch. We managed, but the trees limited our pitch size considerably, and our football was prone to being punctured on Mr. Baker's barbed wire fence. Here you can see me sat with my back to Bakersfield, and you can see the barbed wire fence. In the distance are the railway embankments, and beyond them the rooftops of houses on Park Ave West. This dog is also called Floss and belonged to a friend named John Lawson who lived at number 5 Chanterlands Avenue. John took the photograph. The Baker family kept the horse on the field for 2 or 3 years. But although it eventually went away, its stable remained on the field, and we quickly adopted it as our gang headquarters. It was a bit smelly, but so were we. It was a darn sight easier than building our own den, and it kept us dry on the wettest of days. Unfortunately, it burnt down one night, taking with it Clive and Andy's pet rabbit. Almost immediately after the fire, we managed to acquire an old garden shed that someone was getting rid of. We set that up on Bakersfield, and it became our Stable Mark II. In this photo from the summer of 1971, you can see our shed on the field with Steve Howes and Clive Baker sat on motorbikes, Nick Walker standing, and Jerry Tonette sitting. Clive and his brother Andy were into grass track racing at the time, hence the bikes. Before we move on, I should mention a few other features. During World War II, several bombs landed on radiator fields, and 2 landed on the fields behind Huntley. One hit in the northwest corner of Bakersfield near the 10-foot. There was little sign of the explosion when I was a kid, except that the corner was always a little oddly shaped and was the only place with willow trees, so perhaps some effort had been made to tidy it up. Further into the field was the bomb crater, or Bommy as we knew it. This hole was caused by a high explosive bomb dropped on the night of May the 19th, 1942. A serious and scary event at the time, but a source of great entertainment for several generations of kids. During winter it would inevitably fill with water and was a great place to catch newts and frogs. We would build rafts which always seemed to fall apart halfway across, and when it froze over it became an ice rink. Not that anyone had skates, but it was fun to slide across. There was a tunnel under both embankments. We knew it was there because a section of it that ran across Bakersfield had collapsed. It was a cylindrical brick construction that makes me think of Victorian sewer pipes, but that's not what it was because it didn't go anywhere. Its eastern end was there in Bakersfield, and to get to the western end would have involved passing through the tunnel under the embankments. I never had the nerve to do that, but Gavin Wrigglesworth did, and reported that at the other end a shaft with a steel ladder ran upwards, and it emerged in someone's garden in Park Ave West. It seems more like an emergency escape route, but what the real story is we might never know. Between the two embankments was a short section of drain that had water in it year-round. I'm not sure why, perhaps there was a natural spring there. For the other allotments near the houses, people like Wilf Crowder and Reg Hewitt could run hose pipes from their kitchen sinks onto their allotments if necessary, but the rest of the field could be quite dry, as I believe people have discovered with the recent fenced-off section of the field that has been designated as allotments. We named the spot Bolton's Drain because Mr. Bolton from number 30 maintained a small allotment there. I'm not sure if it was ever an official allotment or if maybe he just decided to make use of the plot, but it was the one area of the field that was drought-proof, and it also provided some of the best clay for our mud-pinging escapades. Speaking of Mr. Bolton, let's finish off our look at the occupants of the remaining houses. Harold and Mabel Bolton lived at number 30 with their daughters Margaret and Linda. Mr. Bolton was an undertaker with Shepherd's on the corner of Beverley Road and Brunswick Avenue. In 1973, his daughter Margaret married Brian Elliker, son of the legendary Ken Elliker, whose bike shop still sits at the top of Murrayfield. As previously mentioned, the Hewitt family lived at number 38 prior to moving into number 25, but in 1939 it was home to Fred and Dora Rhodes. I believe Fred went by his middle name, Cecil. According to a Facebook post by Pam Robinson, Dora was instrumental in opening a youth club somewhere in North Hull. They had a son, Michael, born in 1943. They still lived somewhere in this section of the drive in the late 50s and early 60s. Michael was one of the few car owners on the drive. He had a blue sports car, which he drove at speed, as young men with sports cars tend to do. So when we were playing in the streets, we always had to keep an ear out for him and quickly remove our makeshift goals or wickets from the road before he got there. Number 40 was not listed in the 1939 register, and just like number 41, I have no idea why. Robert and Jean Wrigglesworth, seen here in their living room with their daughters Lynn and Anne, lived at number 42. Their son, Mike, was born in 1961, and by the following year they had moved into a bigger house on Bricknell Avenue. Henry and Edith Burnby and their children Pam and Dave lived at number 46 until 1959, when they moved to Bricknell Avenue. Dave is one of those people I seem to have known forever. Although I don't see him often, we do still bump into each other occasionally. For example, several years ago, I was visiting a friend who lives on the avenues. I didn't know it, but I had the address totally wrong, so I was ringing the doorbell at what was essentially a random address. And to our mutual surprise, Dave answered the door. Small world, eh? Even better, he knew where I needed to be. Thanks, Dave. Wilf and Ruth Pepper moved into number 69 with their son Jack during the war years. Wilf, born in 1911, had quite a successful career as a boxer, fighting under the name Tiger Pepper. In 1940, he damaged his back in an accident on a building site. Following surgery on his back, he was classed as totally disabled and awarded compensation from his former employer in the form of a weekly stipend. His former employer was convinced that he was faking it and had a private detective follow him around, reporting on all the things he was able to do without showing stress or pain. This led to several court cases which, as far as I can tell, Wilf won every time. Perhaps he was secretly earning money on the side in addition to his stipend, because he was one of the first people on the drive to afford a new television. Rob Morton recalls Wilf inviting him and other boys in the neighbourhood into his home to watch a boxing match on TV. Pauline Baker recalls Jack Pepper was always very smartly dressed. He gained some notoriety when the Hull Daily Mail described him as King of Hull's Teenagers, but I'm not sure exactly what he did to win that accolade. Police Constable Tom Sanderson and his wife Effie lived at number 77. Next door to them, Bertie and Annie Gilliard were the original owners of number 79. Bertie had lost a leg fighting in World War I. Their son Ken worked at the Ellerman-Wilson line. Annie died in 1967 and Bertie in December of 1976. Pam and Tim Robinson bought the house from them and lived there from 1977 until 2011. Pam is very active on Facebook and provided me with some of the details used in this video. Thanks, Pam. Edna Witteran and her son Brian lived at number 89. She appears to have been separated or divorced from Brian's father. Edna and Al Stutt's mother Barbara were very good friends, so I often saw her when I was around at Al's house. Brian was a really nice kid, a few years older than me, but always very friendly. Tragically, he died in a car crash in 1970, shortly after his 21st birthday, and Edna was never quite the same after that. Directly behind numbers 69 to 89 was the large concrete and tarmac expanse of the Woolsheds. Personally, I've always used the name Woolsheds as a generic name for all the area enclosed by the railway sidings, Setting Dyke, National Avenue and Perth Street, including the grassy fields to the south of this area. But from Facebook posts I've learned that some people use different names, so for clarity in this video, I shall call the grassy areas Radiator Fields and use Woolsheds to refer to the surfaced area to the north of the fields. Vehicles could access the area via a dirt road that ran from Perth Street West. By the time I was old enough to wander this far, Brown & Sons Limited, a printing shop, occupied the corner across from the National Radiator Works, or Ideal Boilers as it was by then known. Right next door was a kiosk run by a gent called Mr. Campion. He sold sweets and cigarettes, and although I never smoked, those of my friends who did liked the place because they could buy individual cigarettes without any awkward questions about age. He was still there in the mid-70s when I worked at Stelrad, and my sweet tooth meant that I gave him plenty of business. And let's not forget the railway cottages, also known as the Woolsheds cottages. They were located by Radiator Fields. Anne Moffat, who lived in one of the cottages, provided this photograph of the fields with a factory in the background. The cottages themselves would have been just off to the right of this picture. The name Woolsheds derives quite simply from the fact that, at one point, it was the location of sheds used for the storage and grading of wool. At the beginning of the 20th century, Hull was keen to attract both industry and trade. The establishment of the National Radiator Company within the city was hailed as a huge success and promised to help attract other industry. But it was the city's status as the country's third largest port that made international trade an important aspect of the planned economic development of the area. Wool was a particularly important import. By 1906, over £30 million of wool was received in Hull's docks each year. It was, of course, destined for the mills and woolen factories of the industrial north in Hull's hinterland, but facilities were required for the storage and grading of it prior to it being shipped inland by rail. Facilities were built at King George Dock, but additional space was required, and the land right next to the recently completed National Radiator Works provided the perfect place. The Hull and Barnsley Railway Company already owned the land, having had to purchase the farmland through which the Hull and Barnsley line passed. They had already provided a spur line to provide rail access between the factory and the docks, so with the addition of extra sidings, they were able to ship wool directly to the storage sheds that were erected there. Now, I can't be 100% certain, but I believe these photographs show the sheds on the Woolsheds. It's interesting to note that the interior shows electric carts being used to move the wool bales. This was quite a novel feature and merited mention in the Hull Daily Mail in 1920. Around this time, LNER, the London and North East Railway Company, had absorbed the Hull and Barnsley Railway Company and continued to place emphasis on the wool trade by investing in new facilities at King George Dock. This photo from the newspaper shows new storage facilities under construction in December 1920. I'm not sure how long the sheds on the Woolsheds served their original purpose. Certainly World War II would have interrupted normal international trade, so they would not have been needed for the storage of wool by then. In fact, they were probably out of commission by 1933, when a proposal was put to the council to use the site for a city abattoir. Everyone who has ever lived in the neighbourhood should count their blessings and give thanks to the memories of the members of the local community whose strong and vociferous protests caused the plan to be rejected. This photograph shows prefab components being unloaded and stored on the Woolsheds in 1941. You can see Bricknell Ave Infant School in the background, but the junior school had yet to be built. American troops were billeted in the area during World War II and were billeted in huts on the fields near Perth Street, across from the railway cottages. Perhaps some of the original Woolsheds were repurposed to house them, or maybe the components we see being unloaded were for the huts they needed. I've heard the area referred to as an airbase, but I really can't see how it could have been. It was definitely home to a barrage balloon, and may have had an anti-aircraft gun to defend the National Radiator Works. By my day, all of that had disappeared, of course. The Woolsheds was a big, empty expanse, except for a period of several months around 1960, when a huge mountain of coal suddenly appeared. Not only did that give us kids a wonderful opportunity to go climbing and get covered in coal dust, but in a neighbourhood still largely dependent on coal fires, it gave everyone the opportunity to top up the family's fuel supplies one bucket at a time. Finally, let's talk about radiator fields and the Hull Cycle Speedway. In the post-war years, a group of enterprising young lads set up a cycle speedway club and built a cinder track on radiator fields. Anne Moffat recalls, "The racetrack for bicycle racing was at the back of Woolshed cottages in the big field. A group of boys made it, and they were racing every weekend. Teams came from around Hull to enjoy the racing. My mum was always kept busy because they would come to the cottage door for drinks of water. The group that started it were called County Kings, after County Road. There was never any trouble. I still keep in touch with one of the group, Tony Swain, who now lives in Canada." And that brings me to the end of my self-indulgent trip down memory lane. If you stayed watching up to this point, then I'm guessing the area holds many happy memories for you too. I'm indebted to the people listed here who helped jog my memory in places and who provided memories of their own, many of which I've included.